In the manner of Scheherazade, there are tales, dear friends, that drift through the desert winds like grains of sand, each one carrying wisdom, each one holding truth. Some are told in the courts of mighty kings, others whispered in the shadows of bazaars where merchants haggle and beggars wait for mercy. Tonight, I bring you a story older than the stone walls of forgotten cities, a story of transformation, of pride humbled and wisdom earned. It is a story that begins, as so many do, with death and inheritance, channed with a young man who thought he knew everything when in truth he knew nothing at all. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Death of the Old Sultan. In a kingdom cradled between burning sands and cool, moonlit oases, there once lived an old sultan. His name has been lost to time, but his wisdom remains. His beard was as white as desert salt, flowing down to his chest like a river of snow. His eyes, though gentle, had seen the rise and fall of seasons, the hunger of droughts, and the plenty of rain-blessed years. He was a man who understood that a throne is not a place of comfort, but a place of duty. He rose before the sun to hear the petitions of farmers. He walked through the markets in simple robes, listening to the complaints of merchants and the songs of children. When a poor widow came to his gate with tears streaming down her weathered face, he did not send a servant, she went himself. But the old sultan had one great weakness, a weakness known to fathers since the beginning of time. He loved his son too much. This son, this prince, was beautiful. His face was sculpted like those of the ancient statues, his shoulders broad, his movements graceful as a hunting cat. When he rode through the city on his white Arabian horse, women sighed and men nodded with approval. Surely they thought he would be a sultan as magnificent as his father. But beauty, as the wise know, is only the surface of the pool. Beneath it may lie clear water, stagnant mud. The prince had grown up surrounded by silk cushions and silver platters. He had never felt the ache of hunger in his belly or the weight of worry in his heart. Music followed him wherever he went. If he desired something, he merely lifted a finger, and servants rushed to bring it. If he grew bored with a game, he abandoned it. If a friend displeased him, he found another. The old sultan watched his son with both love and concern. "My boy," he would say, placing a weathered hand on the prince's shoulder, "one day you will sit where I sit. You will hold the fate of thousands in your hands. You must learn." But the prince would laugh, that bright, careless laugh of youth. "Father, you worry too much. When I am sultan, the kingdom will prosper. You'll see. I will make our court the envy of the world." And the old sultan would sigh and say nothing more. For how can you teach wisdom to one who believes he already possesses it? The years passed, as years do. The old sultan's hair grew whiter, his steps slower. His cough, which had once been occasional, became constant. The physicians came with their herbs and potions, their prayers and incantations. They shook their heads gravely and spoke in whispers. One night, when the moon hung full and bright over the palace like a silver coin, the old sultan called his son to his bedside. The prince came, though he had been at a banquet and still smelled of wine and perfume. He knelt beside his father's bed, and for the first time in many years, he felt something cold touch his heart. It was the realization that his father, this man who had always been there, strong and constant as the palace walls, was dying. "My son," the old sultan whispered, his voice thin as paper, "I leave you a great treasure. Not gold, though there is gold. Not jewels, though there are jewels. I leave you a people living, breathing, hoping, suffering. They are your responsibility now. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched his son's cheek. "Be gentle with them, my boy. Be just. Remember that a sultan without his people is merely a man sitting in an empty room, talking to himself." The prince felt tears, real tears, spring to his eyes. "I will, father, I promise." The old sultan smiled, closed his eyes, and as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, his breath stopped. The great soul that had guided the kingdom for 40 years slipped away as quietly as a whisper. The funeral was magnificent. The entire city came to mourn. Farmers left their fields, merchants closed their shops, even beggars in the street wept for the man who had never turned them away empty-handed. The prince, now the sultan, walked behind his father's shrouded body, his face properly solemn, his robes black as a moonless night. The people watched him, their eyes red with tears, and wondered, would he be like his father? Would he care for them as the old sultan had? For 3 days, as custom demanded, the prince mourned. He sat in a darkened room, ate little, spoke less. His father's advisors came and went, speaking of matters of state, but the prince barely heard them. His mind was far away, lost in memories of childhood, his father teaching him to ride, to read, to appreciate the poetry of ancient masters. But on the 4th day, something changed. Perhaps it was the weight of silence that had pressed upon him. Perhaps it was the sudden realization that he was truly free for the first time in his life. His father's gentle restraint, his quiet disappointments, his worried looks, all were gone. The prince emerged from his mourning chamber and gave his first order as sultan: "Prepare a feast." The advisors exchanged glances. "My lord," one ventured carefully, "Oh, it is customary to wait." "I am sultan now," the prince interrupted, and there was something sharp in his voice, something that had not been there before. "And I say we feast. My father is with God. He would want us to celebrate his memory with joy, not cling to sorrow like old women." The advisors bowed. What else could they do? And so, on the 4th night after the old sultan's death, the palace rang with music, laughter, and the clatter of wine cups. The young sultan sat on his father's throne, his throne. Now Chan smiled. He raised his cup high and drank deep, and around him the court followed suit. They danced until their feet ached. They ate until the platters were bare. They laughed until their sides hurt. But beyond the palace walls, in the quiet streets where oil lamps flickered in humble windows, the people lay in their beds and listened to the distant sound of celebration. They listened, and they wondered, and some at first began to fear. Chapter 2. A Prince of Endless Gold. In the weeks that followed, the young sultan discovered the intoxicating truth that every new ruler eventually learns. Power is sweet, and freedom sweeter still. No longer did anyone question his decisions. No longer did his father's gentle voice counsel patience or restraint. The treasury, that vast chamber deep within the palace where gold coins lay heaped like golden sand and jewels sparkled in the torchlight chit, was his. All of it, to do with as he pleased. And what pleased the young sultan was magnificence. "Summon musicians from Baghdad," he commanded. "Find me the finest oud player in all the lands. I want singers whose voices make the stars jealous." The musicians came. They filled the halls with melody from dusk until dawn. The young sultan reclined on cushions stuffed with silk and listened, his eyes half closed, a cup of wine always in his hand. "Bring dancers from Damascus," he ordered next. "I want dancers who move like flame, like water, like wind made visible." The dancers came, their ankle bells chiming, their scarves floating like colored mist. They whirled and leaped, and the court applauded until their hands were sore. Carpet the streets, the Sultan decreed one morning, seized by a sudden whim. I wish to ride through the city on a path of silk. His chamberlain, an old man who had served his father, ventured cautiously, My lord, such carpets are costly. Perhaps. Are you questioning me? The chamberlain bowed low. No, my lord, forgive me. So carpets were unrolled through the streets, beautiful carpets woven with peacocks and gardens and geometric patterns that dazzled the eye. The young sultan rode over them on his white horse, scattering coins to the crowds that gathered. The people scrambled for the coins, and the sultan laughed at their eagerness, not seeing the desperation in their eyes. Feast followed feast. Entertainment followed entertainment. The palace became a place of perpetual celebration, a bubble of light and music and excess that floated above the city like a dream chore of fever. But dreams must be paid for, and fever has a price. The old advisors and ministers who had served the previous sultan watched with growing concern. They gathered in small groups in quiet corners, speaking in low voices. The treasury cannot sustain this, said the Minister of Finance, a man whose ledgers were always precise, whose calculations never failed. At this rate, we will be bankrupt within the year. Perhaps, suggested another, we might suggest to the Sultan that he moderate his enthusiasms? They looked at each other. None wished to be the one to approach the throne with such news. Finally, the old chamberlain, the one who had served longest, squared his shoulders. I will speak to him. He found the Sultan in the great hall, surrounded by courtiers and musicians. The young ruler was in high spirits, laughing at a jester's antics, his face flushed with wine. My lord, the chamberlain began, bowing deeply. Might I have a word in private? The Sultan waved a lazy hand. Speak. I have no secrets from my friends. The chamberlain hesitated, then pressed forward. My lord, it concerns the treasury. Your celebrations, while magnificent, are consuming resources at a rate that More resources? The Sultan interrupted. Is that what you're telling me? That I need more gold? No, my lord, I'm saying then find it. The Sultan smiled, but his eyes were cold. Isn't that your job? To manage such things? Surely in a kingdom this size, there is wealth to be found? My lord, the people will be fine, the Sultan said firmly. Now, if there's nothing else, I'm enjoying myself. The chamberlain bowed and withdrew. He returned to the other ministers with a heavy heart. He refuses to listen. Then what do we do? The Minister of Finance sighed, a sound like wind through dry grass. We do what we must. We increase the taxes. And so the proclamation went out. Tax collectors who had once come twice a year now came every season. The rates, which had been fair under the old sultan, doubled, then doubled again. In the farming villages that surrounded the capital, families gathered around dinner tables and stared at the parchments the collectors left behind. The numbers seemed impossible. How can we pay this? Asked a farmer named Hassan, his calloused hands trembling as he held the notice. I've given them half my crop already. His wife, thin and worn from years of hard work, said nothing. She simply rose and went to the corner where they kept their few possessions. She returned with a small bronze lamp that had been her grandmother's. We'll sell this, she said quietly, but that's we'll sell it. Across the kingdom, similar scenes played out. Families sold their heirlooms, their spare clothing, their animals. In the markets, the crowds grew thicker with people trying to sell what little they had. The prices fell. When everyone is selling and no one is buying, nothing has value. The bread makers, pressured by the rising cost of grain, made their loaves smaller. They added more water to the dough, more air. The bread became lighter, less filling, until it was barely more than crust. Mothers who had once fed their children 3 meals a day now stretched 1 meal across morning and night. They added water to the soup, turned it into thin broth, and said with forced brightness, "Eat, my darlings, eat, enjoy your dinner." And the children, who understood more than adults realized, ate without complaint and pretended their stomachs were full. In the palace, the Sultan noticed none of this. He saw only what was brought before him: platters of roasted lamb and honey cakes, bowls of dates and almonds, pitchers of wine cooled with snow brought down from distant mountains at great expense. When he rode through the city, which he did rarely now, finding the dusty streets tedious, she saw only the crowds that gathered to watch. He didn't notice how thin they'd become, how their clothes were patched and repatched, how their eyes followed his jeweled saddle with a hunger that wasn't for gold, but for the food that gold could buy. He lived in a palace of light and music, and beyond its walls the darkness grew. But there was one person who noticed, one person who watched the young Sultan's excesses with eyes that were not filled with concern, but with calculation. His name was Samir, and he was called by all who knew him Samir the Clever. Chapter 3. The Clever Friend. To understand Samir, one must first understand that cleverness and wisdom are not the same thing. Wisdom is a deep well from which truth is drawn slowly, with patience. Cleverness is a quick blade that cuts through problems like butter, but often leaves wounds in its wake. Samir was the most clever man in the kingdom. He had come to the palace 10 years earlier, arriving with a merchant caravan from the east. He'd been nobody then, a young man, with empty pockets and a mouth full of wit. But within weeks, he'd talked his way into a position as a scribe. Within months, he was advising minor officials. Within a year, he caught the attention of the prince himself. The young prince had been delighted by Samir. Here, at last, was someone who didn't lecture him like his father's advisors. Samir told jokes that made him laugh until he cried. Samir knew 100 games of dice and cards, and could make even losing seem fun. Samir could look at any situation and find the trick, the angle, the clever solution that no one else saw. "You're brilliant," the prince had told him one night, drunk on wine and camaraderie. "You should have been born a prince yourself." Samir had laughed and bowed. "I'm content to serve, my lord. Your friendship is treasure enough." But in his heart, Samir had thought, "Why should I serve when I could rule?" Samir had been born in poverty, in a mud brick house in a town so small it had no name, only a number in the tax collector's ledger. His mother had worked until her fingers bled. His father had died young, broken by labor and debt. From childhood, Samir had understood that the world was divided into 2 types of people: those who had power and those who didn't, those who gave orders and those who obeyed, those who ate at full tables and those who scraped their plates. He'd sworn that he would cross from one side to the other, no matter what it took, and he'd done it. Through wit and cunning, through flattery and manipulation, through 1,000 small betrayals that no one noticed, he'd climbed. He'd become indispensable to the prince. The court called him the prince's shadow, and they were right. She was always there, always watching, always whispering in the prince's ear. But shadows are dark things. They have no light of their own. They exist only by blocking something else's brightness, and Samir had grown tired of being a shadow. He watched the young sultan waste his father's legacy, and at first he felt contempt. What a fool, Samir thought, watching the sultan laugh his way through another banquet while the treasury emptied. He has everything, Chand. He's throwing it away like a child discards toys. but contempt slowly transformed into something else, into opportunity. One evening, as he helped the drunken sultan to bed, Samir stood in the doorway and looked back at the throne room. The great chair sat empty, catching the lamplight, its cushions indented from where the sultan had been sitting. In that moment, Samir allowed himself to imagine just for a heartbeat what it would feel like to sit there, not beside the throne, but on it. The thought was like a seed falling into fertile soil. It took root immediately, and it began to grow. Why not? Samir thought. Who would know the difference? I already make half his decisions. I already run half his kingdom. And I would do it better. I would do it properly. I would be the sultan this kingdom deserves. From that night forward, every smile Samir gave the prince was calculated. Every joke had a purpose. Every piece of advice was designed not to help the sultan, but to weaken him, to make him more dependent, more careless, more vulnerable. Samir began to play a very long, very careful game, and he was, as everyone knew, very clever at games. Chapter 4. The Drunken Wager. The opportunity Samir had been waiting for came on a night when the moon hung low and red in the sky like a ruby suspended in black velvet. The palace was hosting another celebration. The sultan could barely remember what they were celebrating anymore. Perhaps it was the anniversary of his coronation. Perhaps someone's birthday. Perhaps nothing at all. The celebrations had become so frequent they blurred together like paint running on wet paper. The great hall was packed with courtiers, merchants who'd paid handsomely for invitations, entertainers and hangers-on who always appeared when free food and wine were available. Torches blazed in their brackets. Musicians played frantically, sweat running down their faces. Dancers whirled, acrobats tumbled, and at the center of it all, on his throne, sat the young sultan with Samir beside him. They had been drinking since sunset. Not the delicate sweet wines that ladies sipped, but strong stuffed wine mixed with spices and something sharper, something that burned going down and left the head spinning. The sultan was at that stage of drunkenness where everything seemed hilarious and profound at once. He'd been telling stories of his youth, each one more exaggerated than the last, and Samir had been laughing at all the right moments, encouraging him, pouring more wine. "I swear to you," the sultan said, his words slightly slurred, "I once rode my horse across the top of the palace wall. My father was furious, but I did it, all the way from one tower to the other, and I never fell once." "Your courage has always been legendary, my lord," Samir said smoothly. He paused, then added as if it were an afterthought, "Though I suppose courage is easy when one has never truly been tested." The sultan's eyes, bleary but sharp, focused on his friend. "What do you mean by that?" Samir waved a hand as if dismissing his own words. Nothing. I only meant that you've always been a prince. You've never had to struggle as common men do. But that's not a criticism, it's simply fortune's blessing upon you." "You think I couldn't struggle?" The sultan sat up straighter. "You think I couldn't endure what common men endure?" "My lord, I'm sure." No. The sultan pointed at Samir with the hand holding his wine cup, sloshing some onto the floor. "You think I'm soft. You think because I was born in a palace, I couldn't survive outside it. Admit it." Samir let a small smile play across his lips. He'd laid the hook, now to see if the fish would bite. "My lord, forgive me, but yes, I think that. Not from any weakness in your character, but simply because, Chow, could you? You've never gone hungry. You've never slept on cold stone. You've never worked with your hands until they bled. These aren't criticisms, they're simply facts. You've lived the life of a prince, and now a sultan. The young sultan's face flushed deeper than wine alone could account for. His pride, that great delicate thing, Chad, been pricked. "I could do it," he said. "I could live as a common man, as a beggar even. I could survive it. For a day, perhaps," Samir agreed, his tone carefully calibrated to suggest doubt without outright disbelief. "Maybe 2. For a month," the Sultan declared, and his voice rang across the hall, cutting through the music. Conversation stopped. Faces turned toward the throne. Samir let his eyes widen. "My lord, surely not. I could do it for a month." The Sultan stood, swaying slightly. "I could live as a beggar for 30 days, and not just survive, I could thrive. I could prove that I'm not soft, that I'm not weak, that I could endure anything any man in this kingdom endures." A hush had fallen over the hall. Everyone was listening now. Samir stood as well, making his voice concerned, doubtful. "My lord, this is the wine talking. In the morning, in the morning I'll still say it." The Sultan pointed at Samir dramatically. "I make you a wager, my friend. Here, before all these witnesses, I will live as a beggar for 1 month, 30 days. I'll wear rags. I'll sleep in the streets. I'll eat what beggars eat. And when I return, you'll bow before me and admit that I am the strongest, most capable man in the kingdom." The courtiers murmured. Some looked shocked, others excited. All recognized they were witnessing something significant, though none could say exactly what. Samir let the moment stretch. Then, slowly, he bowed his head. "If you insist, my lord, I accept your wager, though it pains me to see you suffer." He raised his eyes, and in them was a glint that only he understood the meaning of. "But who will rule while you're gone?" The Sultan waved this away as if it were nothing. "You will, of course. You're my closest friend, my most trusted advisor. You'll sit on the throne, you'll hear the petitions, you'll sign the decrees. You'll be sultan in all but name for 1 month, and when I return, we'll laugh about this grand adventure together." Samir placed a hand over his heart and bowed deeply. "As you command, my lord, I will guard your throne with my life." The Sultan grinned and raised his cup. "To my adventure, to proving that a sultan is still a man, and a man can endure anything." The hall erupted in cheers. Cups were raised. The musicians struck up a triumphant tune, and Samir, still bowing, allowed himself a smile that no one could see. The trap had been set. The prey had walked into it willingly, cheerfully even. Now all that remained was to spring it closed. Chapter 5. A Prince in Rags. Morning came as mornings do after nights of excess, harsh and unforgiving as desert sun on unprotected skin. The Sultan woke with a head that felt like it had been stuffed with cotton and beaten with hammers. His mouth tasted of copper and regret. For a long moment he lay in his silk sheets, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember why he felt a sense of dread beneath the physical discomfort. Then it came back to him. The wager, the boast, the proclamation made before the entire court. He groaned and covered his eyes with his arm. "I'm an idiot," he thought. "I was drunk. Surely no one will hold me touch." But even as the thought formed, he knew it was impossible. He was sultan. His word was law. To back out now would be to admit weakness before the entire court. He'd be a laughingstock. His authority would crumble. Pride, that great engine that had driven him to accept the wager, now drove him to follow through with it. Besides, he thought, sitting up slowly, how hard could it be? 1 month, 30 days. He'd make a game of it, maybe even learn something interesting. And wouldn't it be a tale to tell afterward? The Sultan who lived as a beggar. He could already imagine the poems that would be written, the songs sung. His headache receded slightly. Yes, This could actually be good, an adventure, a story for the ages. He called for servants. Within the hour, Samir arrived at the Sultan's chambers. He looked, the Sultan noted with irritation, completely unaffected by last night's drinking. Fresh as morning dew, his eyes clear, his robes immaculate. "Good morning, my lord," Samir said, bowing. "I trust you slept well?" "Don't be smug," the Sultan muttered. "I suppose you've come to discuss the arrangement. Only if you still wish to proceed, my lord. There's no shame in I'm proceeding." The Sultan stood, trying to ignore the way the room tilted slightly. "A sultan's word is iron. I said I would do this, and I will. But we should establish some rules." "Of course, my lord. I've taken the liberty of drafting some suggestions." Samir produced a rolled parchment. "First, regarding your appearance. You'll need to be unrecognizable. If people know you're the Sultan, obviously, bring me a beggar's clothes." Samir bowed and departed. He returned with servants carrying bundles of fabric that looked like they'd been retrieved from a trash heap. Probably, the Sultan thought, they had been. The robes were brown, patched in multiple places with cloth that didn't match. They were stained with things the Sultan preferred not to identify. The fabric was coarse, scratchy against his skin, who had worn only the finest cotton and silk since childhood. "The beard will need to go," Samir observed, "or at least be trimmed differently. And your hair. Perhaps we could add some gray, some dirt, make you look older, more weathered." The Sultan submitted to the transformation. His carefully groomed beard was hacked shorter. Ash was rubbed into his hair. His hands, soft from a lifetime of never having worked, were dusted with dirt that was pressed into the lines of his palms. When he finally looked in the bronze mirror, he barely recognized himself. Gone was the handsome young Sultan with his oiled beard and jeweled turban. In his place stood a man who looked 40 instead of 25. A man who looked like he'd been beaten by life and kept getting up only out of stubbornness. "Perfect," Samir said softly. "Your own mother wouldn't know you." The Sultan swallowed. His mother had died when he was young, but the reference still stung. He pushed the feeling aside. "The throne is yours for 1 month," he said, turning to face Samir. "Guard it well. Run the kingdom as you see fit. I trust your judgment. When I return, we'll see how well you've done." He smiled, trying to make it light, but something in Samir's eyes made him pause. His friend was looking at him with an expression the Sultan couldn't quite read. Hunger, triumph. It vanished so quickly he might have imagined it. "I will guard your throne as if it were my own life, my lord," Samir said, and bowed deeply. They walked together through the palace, through halls the Sultan had known since childhood. Servants bowed as they passed, though some looked confused. Who was this beggar walking beside the Sultan's trusted advisor? At the great doors that led to the street, Samir turned to him one last time. "My lord," he said quietly, "if at any point you wish to return, send word. I'll come fetch you immediately. There's no shame in "I won't need fetching," the Sultan interrupted. "I'll see you in 30 days. He stepped through the doors. Behind him they swung shut with a sound like thunder, like finality, like the closing of a tomb. Chapter 6. The False Sultan. The palace doors closed behind the prince with a sound that seemed to echo in Samir's chest like a drumbeat. For a long moment he stood there in the entrance hall, staring at those closed doors. On the other side, he knew, the former sultan was walking away into a city he'd never truly known. On this side, Samir stood alone with a future that suddenly seemed to shimmer before him, like a mirage or like something real that he could reach out and grasp. He turned slowly and walked back through the halls. The servants who passed him bowed, but differently than they had before. There was a hesitation in their movements, a question in their eyes. He was not the Sultan. Everyone knew that, but for the next month he would act with the Sultan's authority. The question was, what happened after that month ended? Samir had been asking himself that same question all morning, and slowly, as the hours passed, an answer had formed in his mind like a pearl forming around a grain of sand. Why, he thought, should the prince return at all? He entered the throne room. The great chair sat empty, waiting. Morning light slanted through the high windows, making the gold inlay gleam. Samir approached it slowly, reverently. He'd stood beside this throne 1,000 times. He'd whispered advice to the man who sat upon it. He'd watched fools and wise men alike bow before it, but he had never sat in it. He reached out and touched the armrest. The wood was smooth, worn by generations of rulers, warm from the sun. Just to try it, he thought, just to see how it feels. He sat down. The cushion beneath him was stuffed with the finest materials. The height was perfect, elevated enough to look down on those who approached, but not so high as to seem ridiculous. From here he could see the entire hall, could imagine it filled with courtiers and petitioners, all looking up at him, not beside him, not behind him, at him. "My Lord Samir?" He jerked, startled, and looked toward the door. The old chamberlain stood there, the same man who had served the previous sultan and tried to counsel his son. "Aichi," Samir began, then stopped. He'd been about to apologize, to explain, but something in him resisted. Why should he apologize? He'd been given authority. The sultan himself had commanded it. He settled back into the throne and made his voice casual. "Yes? What is it?" The chamberlain's face was carefully neutral. "The morning petitions, my lord. Do you wish to hear them, or shall we postpone until the sultan returns?" "I'll hear them," Samir said. "Bring the petitioners in." "As you command, my lord." The chamberlain withdrew, and Samir sat in the throne, his heart beating faster, his mind already racing ahead. 30 days, he thought. I have 30 days to make this permanent. For the first few days, Samir was cautious. He played the role of faithful steward. He heard petitions with patience, consulted the advisors, made no dramatic changes. He wanted everyone to grow comfortable with seeing him in this position. But he also began, subtly, to consolidate his position. He promoted guards who were loyal to him personally, men he'd cultivated over the years with small gifts and careful attention. He moved them to key positions, the palace gates, the treasury, the sultan's private chambers. He held private meetings with the kingdom's wealthy merchants. "The sultan and I have always been close," he told them. "Whatever arrangements you made with him will, of course, be honored. Unless you'd prefer to renegotiate, perhaps we could find terms more favorable to all parties?" The merchants, who understood power and its shifting nature better than most, nodded thoughtfully. They began to bring their concerns to Samir instead of waiting for the sultan's return. He met with the ministers one by one. To each he said, "The sultan trusts me. The question is, can I trust you? When he returns, I'll be advising him on appointments, on promotions, on many things. I hope I can count on your support." Some agreed immediately. Others hesitated, but eventually nodded. A Fuse, the old chamberlain, among them, remained visibly skeptical. Samir made mental notes of who was who. And then, on the 5th day, when he was certain his initial groundwork was secure, Samir began to plant the seeds of doubt. He started small. A comment here, a question there, dropped carefully in conversations with courtiers and advisors. "I wonder how our Sultan fares," he'd say, shaking his head with apparent concern. "A month is a long time on the streets. Anything could happen to a man." "Do you think he'll truly last the full 30 days?" he'd ask, letting worry creep into his voice. "He's never known hardship. What if something happens to him? Perhaps," he suggested to the captain of the guard, "we should have some men watching the streets discreetly, just to ensure our Sultan comes to no harm. After all, he's in rags. Chanyon could attack him, rob him, even—" He let the sentence trail off meaningfully. The captain nodded slowly. "You want him protected, my lord?" Samir met his eyes. This captain was one of his man who owed his position to Samir's recommendation. "I want to know where he is," Samir said softly, "and I want to ensure that this experiment doesn't end in tragedy. For the kingdom's sake, you understand. We can't have our Sultan injured, or worse." The captain understood perfectly. "I'll assign men immediately, my lord." "Quietly," Samir emphasized. "We wouldn't want to embarrass the Sultan by letting him know he's being watched." "Of course, my lord." The captain left to make arrangements, and Samir sat back in the thronech's throne. He was beginning to think of it. Chand smiled. The net was being woven. Soon it would be time to draw it tight. But first, he needed to know one thing for certain. Would the beggar prince break on his own, or would he need to be broken? It was time to test him. Chapter 7. Trials in the Dust. The prince's first night on the streets was, in retrospect, almost amusing in its naivety. He'd walked out of the palace with a spring in his step, curious and excited. An adventure, a tale to tell. He'd see how the common people lived, prove his resilience, and return in triumph. The reality struck him like a slap before he'd gone 3 blocks. The streets outside the palace were broad and clean, swept daily by workers. But as he walked further from the wealthy district, the streets grew narrower, dirtier. Garbage accumulated in corners. The smell, she'd never noticed it from inside his cushioned carriage, was overwhelming. Human waste, rotting food, smoke from cooking fires, unwashed bodies, and animal dung all mixed into an odor that made his stomach turn. People brushed past him without a second glance. In his rags, he was invisible. No one bowed. No one stepped aside. A woman carrying a heavy basket bumped into him and cursed at him for being in her way. "I'm sorry," he began, but she was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. By midday, he was hungry. He'd never been truly hungry before. There had been times when he'd skipped a meal to attend to something else, and he'd felt the mild discomfort of an empty stomach. This was different. This was a gnawing, insistent pain that made him think of nothing else. He had no money. Of course he had no money. That was part of the wager. He was a beggar now. So he did what beggars do. He begged. He approached a baker's stall, where round loaves of bread steamed in the morning air. The smell made his mouth water. "Excuse me," he said to the baker, a stout man with flour-dusted arms. "I'm very hungry. Could you spare a piece of bread?" The baker looked him up and down with a contempt that shocked the prince. "I work for my bread. Why don't you?" "Aichi would, but I have no employment. If you could just—" "Move along," the baker said flatly. "You're driving away customers." The prince moved along, his face burning. He tried again at a fruit seller's stall, and again at a place selling grilled meat. Each time he was met with cold refusal or outright hostility. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith and his hunger became almost unbearable, an old woman sitting beside a mosque took pity on him. She had almost nothing herself, just a small piece of hard bread she'd been softening in a cup of water. But she broke it in half and offered him a piece. "Here, grandson," she said, her eyes milky with cataracts. "Eat." He took it with trembling hands and ate. It was the worst bread he'd ever tasted, stale, tough, barely flavored. It was the best thing he'd ever eaten. "Thank you," he whispered. "God bless you." She patted his hand. "We're all hungry together. No use being misers with each other." As he walked away, the prince felt something he'd never felt before. Shame. Not embarrassment, not awkwardness, but deep, burning shame. This woman who had almost nothing had shared with him, while he, in his palace, had thrown away enough food each night to feed a dozen families. The realization sat in his stomach like a stone. That night, he sought shelter. The nights in the desert were cold, even in the city where buildings trapped some warmth. He'd worn fine robes his entire life, with blankets of wool and silk. Now he had only his thin, ragged robe. He found an archway in the old market, where several other beggars had already settled for the night. They eyed him suspiciously, another mouth competing for charity, another body taking up space. "This spot's taken," one of them growled, a man missing most of his teeth. "Please," the prince said, "I just need a place to sleep. Find your own." He moved on. He tried several other places, doorways, alcoves, a covered spot behind a closed merchant's stall. Each time he was driven off by other beggars who'd claimed those territories. Finally, exhausted, he found a place where two walls met at an angle, creating a small corner. It wasn't covered, but at least the walls blocked some wind. He curled up there, trying to make himself small, trying to conserve warmth. Sleep came eventually, but it was nothing like the deep, restful sleep of his soft bed. He woke every hour, shivering, aching. Footsteps would jerk him alert, strange sounds, screams, laughter. The cry of cats fighting kept him on edge. When dawn finally came, painting the sky pink and gold, he'd never been so grateful to see morning light. He stood, his body stiff and sore, and thought, one day down, 29 to go. On the second day, the trials truly began. He was in the market, trying to find someone who might give him food or perhaps offer him work, when 3 men surrounded him. They were young, strong, with the hard eyes of those who lived by violence. Street thugs, the prince realized. He'd heard of them, but never seen them. Guards kept them away from the wealthy districts. "New to the area, aren't you?" the leader said. He was tall, with a scar running down his left cheek. Yes, I'm just passing through." "See, that's the problem." The scarred man stepped closer. "This market, it belongs to us. Anyone who wants to beg here, anyone who wants to sleep here, they pay us. Protection fee, you understand?" "I have no money," the prince said honestly. "Then you have a problem." The punch came without warning. The prince had never been hit before, not really hit, not with intent to harm. The fist caught him in the stomach, driving the air from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping. Another punch, this one to his face. Pain exploded across his cheek. He fell to his knees. The men kicked him then, not with wild fury, but with practiced efficiency. Ribs, back, legs, teaching him a lesson. "Tomorrow," the scarred man said, standing over him, "you find money, or you find another market. Understand?" The prince could only nod, blood running from his split lip. They left him lying in the dirt. A few people glanced at him as they passed, but no one stopped. Violence was common here. People learned to look away. Eventually, he dragged himself to his feet and limped away, every breath sending sharp pains through his ribs. He found a fountain chone of the public ones in the poor quarter, where water was free but often dirty. Chan washed his face. As the blood swirled away in the water, he heard something that made him freeze. 2 men were talking nearby, not seeing him in the shadow of the fountain. "Did you hear? The new Sultan, the advisor who's sitting on the throne now. She wants the streets cleaned up. says there are too many beggars making the city look bad. What's that mean for us? Means the guards will be rougher. Means they'll be moving people along more, throwing them out of the good spots. Heard they might start arresting beggars for vagrancy. The men moved on, but the prince stayed crouched by the fountain, thinking. The new sultan, Samir, his friend. Was Samir behind this? Or was it just coincidence? Something cold moved through the prince's chest. Suspicion, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. The next days blurred together in a haze of hunger, cold, and constant movement. Every time he found a relatively safe place to sleep, guards would appear and drive him off. Every time he tried to beg in a spot where people seemed generous, those same street thugs would appear, demanding money he didn't have, delivering beatings when he couldn't pay. He tried to find work. He went to the docks where men were hired to load and unload ships. But when he approached, the foreman looked him over and laughed. "Look at those hands. You've never done a day's work in your life. You'd be useless. Move along." He tried the construction sites where buildings were being raised. Same response. He tried to offer services, carrying water, running messages, cleaning. No one would hire him. He looked too old, too worn, too unreliable. And everywhere he went he began to notice them, men who watched him. They tried to be subtle, but the prince chance he knew to look could spot them. They wore ordinary clothes, but they moved with the discipline of soldiers. They followed at a distance, never approaching, just watching. Were they protecting him, or making sure he didn't escape his fate? He didn't know, but he was beginning to suspect. One night, as he shivered in an alley, sharing space with rats that scratched in the darkness, the prince finally understood something his father had tried to teach him years ago. A kingdom isn't made of palaces and gold. It's made of people. And if those people are suffering, then the kingdom, no matter how beautiful its buildings, just rotten at its core. He had built his palace of pleasure on the backs of people like the old woman who'd shared her bread. People like these beggars huddling in the cold. People who went to bed hungry so their children could eat. The shame he'd felt that first day became something deeper, became resolve. If I survive this, he thought, if I make it back to that throne, Chai will be different. I will be better. I will be the sultan my father wanted me to be. But first, he had to survive. And as he would soon discover, there were those who would make sure he didn't. Chapter 8. The Woman of the Clay Lamps. On the 8th day of his ordeal, the prince came very close to breaking. He'd slept poorly again, night spent under a bridge, listening to the river slap against stone pillars, waking every time footsteps crossed overhead. His ribs still ached from the beating 3 days ago. His stomach was a knot of constant pain. When he stood, the world tilted, and he had to lean against the bridge's wall until his vision cleared. I could end this, he thought, not for the first time. I could walk to the palace right now, reveal who I am, sleep in my bed tonight with a full belly. But his pride wouldn't let him, and something else too, stubborn determination not to prove Samir right. Not to be the soft, weak prince that everyone assumed he was. He climbed up from beneath the bridge and began walking. He had no destination in mind, just a vague need to move, to do something, to keep going. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Beautiful, he thought distantly. He'd never really looked at sunsets before. From the palace windows, they'd just been a signal that dinner would be served soon. His feet, blistered and aching in the worn sandals he'd been given, carried him through unfamiliar streets. He'd wandered far from the market districts, far from anywhere he recognized. These streets were the poorest he'd seen yet, narrow alleys where buildings leaned against each other like drunk men, where laundry hung overhead like faded flags, where children played in dirt because there was nowhere else. And then he smelled it. Bread, baking bread. His hunger, which had become a dull, constant companion, suddenly sharpened into a craving so intense it was almost painful. He followed the smell like a dog follows a scent. It led him to a doorway narrow, weathered, painted blue once, but now faded to gray. The door was half open, and through it he could see the glow of a clay oven and shadows moving. He heard a woman's voice, calm and gentle. "Layla, take this bread to old man Yusuf at the corner. He won't admit it, but he hasn't eaten in 2 days. A younger voice. "But Mama, that's half our bread. Then we'll eat half. God provides, my heart. He always has." The prince stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, and knocked. The conversation inside stopped. Footsteps approached, and the door swung fully open. A woman stood there. She was perhaps 30 years old, though hardship had carved lines around her eyes and mouth that made her seem older. Her robe was patched, but clean. Her hair was covered with a simple scarf. Her hands, he noticed, were rough and calloused from work. But her eyes were bright and clear, filled with a warmth he hadn't seen in days. "Yes," she said, and her voice held no suspicion, only curiosity. For a moment, the prince couldn't speak. He'd been refused so many times, driven away so many times, that he'd almost forgotten how to ask. Forgive me," he finally managed. His voice came out hoarse. "I know I have no right to ask, but I'm very hungry. If you could spare even a crust of bread, I would be grateful." The woman studied him. Her gaze moved over his ragged clothes, his bruised face, his trembling hands. But unlike the baker who'd looked at him with contempt, she looked at him with something else. Understanding, perhaps, or simple human compassion. Behind her, 2 children appeared, a girl of perhaps 10 and a boy a few years younger. They stared at him with wide eyes. "Mama," the girl whispered. The woman made a decision. He saw it happen. Something in her face shifted from uncertainty to resolve. "We're not rich," she said, "but we don't close our door to the hungry. Come in." The house, it could be called that, consisted of a single room. A clay oven in one corner still radiated warmth. Sleeping mats were rolled against one wall. A few pots and bowls sat on a crude shelf. That was all. But it was clean, scrupulously clean. The floor was swept, the walls free of grime, the few possessions they had arranged with care. "Sit," the woman said, gesturing to a cushion threadbare but neatly mended. "Layla, bring our guest some water. Tariq, add a bit more wood to the fire." The children moved to obey, still watching him with curiosity. The prince lowered himself to the cushion, his body aching with gratitude for even this simple comfort. The woman brought him a bowl of lentil stew, thin, barely more than broth, with a few lentils floating in it, but hot and savory, and bread chaff, a round loaf, still warm from the oven. "Eat," she said simply. He ate. He tried to eat slowly, with dignity, but his hunger overwhelmed him. He nearly wept at the taste, not because it was delicious, though to him, at that moment, it was, but because of what it represented: kindness, mercy, the simple act of one human helping another. When he finished, he looked up to find the entire family watching him. "Thank you," he said, and his voice broke slightly. "You can't know what this means." The woman smiled. "We know hunger in this house. We know what it means to need help." She paused, then added, "My name is Amina. This is my daughter Layla, and my son Tariq. He hesitated. He'd been using no name, trying to avoid questions, but something about this woman's straightforward kindness made him want to be honest, just honest as he could be. "You can call me Farid. It was the first name that came to him, a common name, nothing special. Farid, Amina repeated. That means unique, are you? He almost laughed. I'm beginning to think I'm depressingly common. They talked as the evening deepened. The children, their initial shyness overcome, asked him questions. Where was he from? Did he have family? Why was he alone? He answered carefully, staying close to the truth when he could. He'd had a disagreement with his family. He was trying to make his own way. He'd found it harder than expected. Amina listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, her words had a quiet wisdom to them. Pride, she said at one point, is expensive. Sometimes the cost is too high. He looked at her sharply, wondering if she suspected something. But her expression was simply thoughtful, not suspicious. I lost my husband 2 years ago, she continued. Fever. When he died, I had nothing. She'd been the one who worked, who earned. I didn't know how to provide for my children. I nearly starved before I swallowed my pride and asked for help. What happened? An old woman in the market, she sold bread, just a few loaves a day. She saw me begging and did something remarkable. She gave me half her bread. Every day for a week, she gave me half her bread. And she said something I'll never forget. Amina looked at her children, making sure they were listening too. This was clearly a story she'd told before, a lesson she wanted them to learn. She said, in this world, we are all beggars before God. We all depend on His mercy. So when we have something to give, we give it, because tomorrow we might be the one who needs help. The Prince Farid felt something shift in his chest. A tightness he hadn't even known was there loosened slightly. That woman, he said quietly, was wiser than many who claim to be wise. She was a beggar, Amina said. She knew what mattered. They let him sleep there that night. They gave him a mat and a thin blanket, and he lay in the corner of their small room, listening to the family's breathing as they slept. He should have felt uncomfortable. This room was smaller than his closet in the palace, and he was sleeping on the floor. But instead, he felt something he hadn't felt since leaving the palace. Safe. In the darkness, he heard Layla whisper to her mother, Mama, will he stay? I don't know, precious. Sleep now. I hope he stays. I like him. Hush, sleep. The prince closed his eyes, and for the first time in 8 days, he slept deeply and without fear. When he woke in the morning, sun was streaming through the small window, and Amina was already up, preparing a meager breakfast. She saw him stirring and smiled. Good morning, Farid. I hope you slept well. He sat up and realized something remarkable. His body still ached. He was still hungry. But something inside him had changed. He felt lighter, as if he'd put down a burden he'd been carrying without knowing it. I did, he said. Thank you for everything. I should go. I've imposed enough. Nonsense. If you have nowhere to go, you can stay here. We could use help. There's always work to be done, water to fetch, wood to gather. If you're willing to work, you're welcome to stay. He looked at her, this woman who had so little but offered so much, and felt something crack in his heart, the last shell of his old arrogance. I would be honored, he said. And so the prince, who had never worked a day in his life, began to learn what work truly meant. Beggar, Chapter 9. What the prince learned. The days that followed were unlike anything the prince had ever experienced. He woke at dawn with the family not because servants roused him, but because the cold and the roosters crowing made sleep impossible. There was no leisurely lying in bed, no breakfast brought to him. If they wanted to eat, they had to work for it first. His first task was carrying water. The well is 3 streets over, Amina explained, handing him 2 heavy clay jugs. "Fill them both and bring them back. We'll need 6 trips to have enough for the day." 6 trips. The prince hefted the jugs. They were lighter empty than he'd expected. He walked to the well, where a line of women and children already waited their turn. They eyed him curiously, Chaman doing what was usually women's work, but said nothing. When his turn came, he lowered the bucket into the well, pulled it up, and poured it into his jugs. Now they were heavy, very heavy. He began the walk back, and within half a block, his arms were burning. By the time he reached Amina's door, he was shaking with effort. Water had sloshed out, soaking his robe and the street. "1," Amina said cheerfully. 5 more to go." By the 4th trip, his hands were cramping. By the 6th, he could barely lift the jugs. He set them down inside the house and collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. Layla giggled. "Are you tired already? Mama does this every day." He looked at Amina with new eyes. This woman who seemed so slight carried water twice a day, every day, plus all her other work, and she did it without complaint, often while he'd been sleeping on silk sheets and ringing a bell when he wanted wine. "I'm learning," he said between gasps, "that I know nothing." Amina smiled. "Learning is good. Now rest a moment, then there's wood to gather for the oven." The work never stopped. There was always something that needed doing. He gathered scraps of wood from demolition sites and the edges of the broken crates, discarded palm fronds, anything that would burn. His soft hands developed blisters that burst and bled, then hardened into calluses. He swept the floor, learning that even this simple task had technique. You had to angle the broom just right, work in sections, get into the corners where dust gathered. He went to the market with Amina, helping her carry her meager purchases, and there, moving through the crowded stalls, he began to truly see his city for the first time. The bread that cost a copper coin, she'd once spent that much on a single sugared almond to feed to his horse. Now he watched Amina count her coppers 3 times before making the purchase, knowing it had to last the family 2 days. The vegetable sellers with their bruised and wilted produce cheese selling what the wealthy wouldn't buy. Amina haggled over every price, not from greed, but from necessity. The difference of a single coin meant the difference between her children eating well or going to bed with their stomachs hurting. He saw the tax collectors moving through the market, and he watched how people reacted. They didn't bow respectfully as they did in the wealthy districts. They hunched their shoulders and avoided eye contact, like animals avoiding a predator. He saw a farmer cha man with sun-weathered skin and hands gnarled from work being told his taxes had increased again. "But I can't pay more," the farmer protested. "I barely make enough now." "Then sell your land," the tax collector said indifferently. "The Sultan needs revenue. Take it up with him if you don't like it." The farmer walked away, defeated, and the prince felt sick. The Sultan, that was supposed to be him. This was being done in his name. His wasteful spending had caused this. One evening, as they sat around the small fire eating their dinner, trees stretched thin with extra water to make it feed 4 people instead of 3, Layla asked him a question. "Farid, why don't you have a family?" The prince paused, his bowl halfway to his mouth. "I did, once, but I lost them." "Did they die?" Tariq asked with a child's blunt curiosity. "In a way," he said, thinking of the life he'd left behind. "I made choices that took me away from them." Amina, as always, was watching him with those perceptive eyes. "Do you regret it?" He thought about that. Did he regret the wager? Did he regret leaving the palace? A week ago, he would have said yes. But now, "I regret what led to it," he said carefully. I regret not seeing clearly when I should have. But what I'm learning now, I think I needed to learn it." "What are you learning?" Layla asked. He looked at this small girl with her bright eyes and serious expression, this child who'd never had a toy he hadn't broken or abandoned, who wore a dress that had been mended so many times it was more patches than original fabric Chand, who smiled more genuinely than anyone in his palace ever had. "I'm learning," he said, "what matters." The nights were perhaps the best time. After the work was done and the meager dinner eaten, the family would sit together. Sometimes Amina would tell stories, old tales passed down from her grandmother. Sometimes the children would play quiet games with pebbles and string. Sometimes they just sat and talked about small things, a funny incident in the market, a neighbor's goat that had escaped, the weather. It was during one of these quiet evenings that the prince realized something profound. These people were happy, not happy in the way he'd understood happiness before, the bright, feverish happiness of wine and music and expensive entertainment. This was something deeper, something that came from connection, from shared struggle, from knowing that even though life was hard, they faced it together. "Why do you share with me?" he asked Amina one night after the children had fallen asleep. "You have so little. Every meal I eat takes food from your children's mouths." Amina was mending a shirt by the firelight, her needle moving with practiced precision. She didn't answer immediately. "Do you know what the worst thing about being poor is?" she finally said. "It's not the hunger, though, that's hard. It's not the work, though that's exhausting. It's the way people look through you, as if you're not really there, as if you don't matter." She tied off a thread and looked up at him. "When I was new to this, when I first became a widow, I felt invisible, like I'd stopped being a person and become just a problem, a beggar. Something to be stepped around. That old woman who helped me, she didn't just give me bread. She gave me dignity. She saw me." Amina returned to her mending. "So when someone comes to my door hungry, I remember that. I remember what it felt like to be invisible, and I choose to see them instead." The prince felt his throat tighten. He thought of all the beggars he'd passed in his carriage, never really looking at them. All the petitioners at his court who he'd half listened to while thinking about his next entertainment. "I was blind," he whispered. "Then now you see," Amina said simply. "That's something." He began to venture out more during the days, to explore the city he thought he'd known. But this time, he wasn't riding through in a carriage. He was walking the same streets as everyone else, seeing it from their eye level. He saw how the public fountains in poor districts ran with brownish water, while those in wealthy districts ran clear. He saw how the streets he'd ordered carpeted for his triumph were still clean, while the streets where people actually lived were choked with garbage that no one collected. He saw the children Chiso, many children Chi working, carrying loads, running messages, helping in shops, anything to earn a copper coin for their families. Children who should have been playing, learning, growing. And he began to hear the talk. In the markets, in the corners where men gathered to smoke and gossip, the talk was all about the new Sultan, Samir, the advisor, the one who's on the throne now. They say he's making changes. Changes? You mean making things worse? Taxes have gone up again, 5th time this month. Where's the real Sultan? The young one? Who knows? Probably dead in a ditch somewhere. Heard he made some stupid bet and wandered off. Good riddance, if you ask me. He was no better than this new one. Both of them just taking, never giving anything back. The prince listened to these conversations with a sinking heart. This was what his people thought of him, and they were right. He had been no better, But something else worried him more, the talk about Samir, about changes, about taxes increasing even more. He thought about the men he'd noticed following him, about how every place he tried to find shelter, he was driven away, about how work seemed impossible to find. Samir wouldn't, he thought. He's my friend. But was he? The prince found himself thinking back over their friendship, and for the first time, seeing it clearly. Had Samir ever really been his friend? Or had he always been circling, waiting for an opportunity? The wager. That cursed wager. Whose idea had it really been? The prince had thought it was his own drunken boast, but Samir had suggested it first, hadn't he? Planted the seed, knowing the prince's pride would water it. He's trying to get rid of me, the prince realized with cold certainty. This is all a trap. Chapter 10. Assassins in the Night. The realization that Samir meant him harm came too late to prevent what happened next. It was the 15th night since leaving the palace halfway through the wager. The prince was sleeping in his usual spot in Amina's house, having spent the day helping repair a neighbor's roof. His body ached from the work, but it was a good ache, the ache of accomplishment rather than suffering. He woke to the sound he'd learned to recognize in his time on the streets, the careful footstep of someone trying to be quiet, too quiet. Ordinary people walking at night make noise. Only those with ill intent try to silence their steps. His eyes opened in the darkness. The room was lit only by the dying embers in the oven, casting a faint reddish glow. By that glow, he saw a figure slip through the curtain that served as a door-cha figure that didn't belong there. The figure was a man, dressed in dark clothes, face wrapped to show only his eyes. And in his hand, catching the faint firelight, was the curved blade of a knife. The prince's heart began to pound. His first instinct was to cry out, to wake the family, to call for help. But something stopped him, Chet, the knowledge that if this became a fight, Amina and her children were in danger. He lay perfectly still, watching through slitted eyes as the figure crept closer. The assassin moved toward him with professional care, knife held low and ready. When the man was close enough, the prince moved. Years of training chi-sword lessons he'd barely paid attention to. Wrestling matches with palace guards. Physical training he'd considered a boring obligation. Chal came back in an instant. He rolled sideways as the knife came down, hearing it scrape against the floor where his chest had been a moment before. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting hard. The assassin grunted in surprise but didn't drop the knife. They struggled silently, each trying not to wake the sleeping family, locked in a desperate, quiet dance of violence. The prince was stronger than he'd been when he left the palace. Weeks of hard labor had built muscle his soft life had never required. But the assassin was trained, professional. He knew how to fight. They crashed into the wall. The knife flashed between them. The prince felt the blade graze his arm, a line of fire opening across his bicep. He ignored it and drove his knee into the man's stomach. The assassin folded, gasping, and the prince twisted his wrist again, harder this time. The knife finally fell, clattering to the floor. "Who sent you?" the prince hissed, maintaining his grip. Instead of answering, the assassin spoke, and his voice held a mixture of surprise and something like respect. "The Sultan sends his greetings, Beggar." The words hit the prince like a physical blow. The Sultan, Samir. "Why?" the prince demanded. "Why does he want me dead?" The assassin laughed, a bitter sound. "Ask your own face in a mirror, if you ever see one again. He fears what you are. What I am. I'm nothing. I'm a beggar. Are you?" The assassin's eyes, all the prince could see of his face, glittered in the dimness. "Or are you someone who might come back, someone who might reclaim what was taken?" Someone who knows too much about how power really works in this city? Before the prince could respond, Amina's voice cut through the darkness. Farid, what's happening? She stood in the doorway to the small sleeping alcove where she and the children slept, her eyes wide with fear. The assassin used the distraction. He twisted in the prince's grip. Professional training overcoming the prince's makeshift hold. Chand broke free. Instead of continuing the fight, he ran, slipping out through the door curtain and into the night. The prince started to follow, then stopped. He couldn't leave Amina and the children unprotected. What if there were more assassins? What if this was just the first? He stood there, breathing hard, blood running down his arm from the knife wound. Amina rushed to him, her face pale. You're hurt. What happened? Who was that man? An enemy, the prince said, the simplest truth. Someone who... I have enemies, Amina. She stared at him, and he saw understanding dawn in her eyes. She'd suspected he was more than he'd claimed. Now she was certain. Sit, she ordered, her tone brooking no argument. Let me see that wound. As she cleaned and bound his arm with strips torn from a spare cloth, the children watching with wide, frightened eyes, the prince's mind raced. Samir had sent an assassin, not to protect him, as he'd claimed, to kill him. And now that the first attempt had failed, there would be others. He couldn't stay here. Every moment he remained put Amina and her children in danger. But where could he go? Back to the palace? Even if he revealed himself, Samir had been building power for 2 weeks now. He might have enough loyal men to refuse the prince's return. Or worse, kill him at the gates. You need to leave, Amina said quietly, echoing his thoughts. I don't know who you are or what trouble follows you, but if people are trying to kill you, you can't stay here. My children... I know, the prince interrupted. I'm sorry. I never meant to bring danger to your door. I don't blame you, she said, meeting his eyes. But you need to go, tonight. Amina, go, she repeated more firmly. Then more gently, but before you do, tell me something. Are you running from justice? Did you do something terrible? The prince thought about that. Had he done something terrible? Yes. He'd been a wasteful, careless ruler who'd ignored his people's suffering. But he was trying to be better. I did terrible things, he said honestly. But I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be better than I was. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. Then go, survive, become better, and maybe someday when you're safe, you'll come back and tell me the whole truth. She pressed something into his hand, a small cloth bundle. When he opened it, he found bread, a few dates, and 2 copper coins. Amina, I can't take your food. Take it, she insisted. You saved us tonight, whether you know it or not. That man would have killed you, and then he might have killed us as witnesses. You fought him instead of crying out, protecting my children. So take the food. It's a small repayment. The prince felt tears, real tears burning in his eyes. He pulled Amina into a brief, tight embrace. Thank you, he whispered, for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible, for teaching me what kindness means. I won't forget you. Go, she said again, her own voice thick with emotion. Before more come. He gathered his few possessions, nothing really, just the ragged clothes on his back. Chand slipped out into the night. Behind him, in the doorway, he saw Amina watching with Layla and Tariq clutching her sides. He raised a hand in farewell, and they waved back. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, not knowing where he was going, knowing only that he couldn't stop moving. Not yet. Not while Samir's assassins hunted him. But something had changed inside him. He was no longer running from his fate. He was moving toward something. Toward a future where he would be strong enough, wise enough, supported enough to reclaim what had been taken. He was moving toward becoming the sultan his people deserved. But first he had to survive. Shahr, Chapter 11, The People's Whisper. The prince spent 3 days moving through the city like a ghost, never staying in one place long enough to be found, always watching for the shadows that might be Samir's men. He slept in different places each night, in an abandoned building, the next in a cart full of hay, the third in a graveyard where no one would think to look. His wound, though Amina had cleaned it well, ached and throbbed. He had no money for medicine, but he kept it as clean as he could with water from public fountains. During the days, he moved through the poorest quarters of the city, the places where Samir's guards rarely ventured because there was nothing there worth guarding. And as he moved, he began to see his city with completely new eyes. He saw a woman, heavily pregnant, still carrying water because there was no one else to do it. He took the jugs from her without asking and carried them to her home. She wept and thanked him, and he thought, I once spent more on a single entertainment than it would cost to hire water carriers for every pregnant woman in this city. He saw an old man struggling to push a cart with a broken wheel through the rutted street. He stopped and helped, and together they mended the wheel with scraps of wood and rope. The old man offered him a dried fig from his meager stock as payment, and the prince accepted it with more gratitude than he'd ever felt for a feast. He saw children chalways, the children haunted him now, begging in the market. Not because they were orphans, but because their parents couldn't feed them on what they earned. He gave them the copper coins Amina had given him, knowing he'd go hungry but unable to see them suffer. Word began to spread, as word always does in the close quarters of poverty. There's a beggar, people whispered. A strange one. He helps without asking for payment. I saw him carry water for old widow Rashida all afternoon, said one woman to another at the well. She offered him food, but he wouldn't take it, said she needed it more. He stopped some boys from beating a dog, reported a street vendor. Didn't threaten them, didn't hit them, just talked to them quiet-like until they were ashamed and left the poor creature alone. He gave his bread to my children, a father told his neighbors. My children, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days himself. The stories multiplied, spreading through the poor quarters like ripples in a pond. People began to watch for him, this mysterious beggar who acted like no beggar they'd ever known. It was on the 18th day that someone finally asked him the question directly. He'd been helping a carpenter carry lumber. The man's assistant had fallen sick, and he couldn't move the heavy beams alone. The prince worked for hours in the hot sun, his muscles screaming, his wounded arm burning, but he didn't stop until the job was done. When they finished, the carpenter grizzled man named Rashid with sawdust permanently embedded in his beard sat down heavily and gestured for the prince to join him. You work harder than most men I pay, Rashid observed, offering the prince water from his skin. Yet you ask for nothing. Why? The prince drank deeply before answering. The truth, he'd discovered, was easier than lies, simpler. It required no memory, no careful construction. I'm paying a debt, he said. To whom? To everyone. The prince looked out at the street where people were going about their difficult lives. I once had much and gave little. Now I have little, but I can give what I have, my labor, my time, my strength. Rashid studied him for a long moment. You speak like an educated man. You work like a laborer. You move like a soldier, but you dress like a beggar. What are you really? The prince met his eyes. I'm someone who's learning to be better than he was. Rashid pulled at his beard, a gesture the prince would come to recognize as his thinking pose. You know what people are saying about you? No. They're saying you're either a saint or a fool. Maybe both. Rashid smiled slightly. They're also saying that if every man in this city helped his neighbor the way you do, we wouldn't need a sultan at all. The words struck the prince like a bell being rung. We wouldn't need a sultan at all. What did that say about the sultanate he'd inherited? What did it say about the job he'd done? The sultan, the prince said carefully. What do people say about him now? Rashid's expression darkened. Which one? The fool who left, or the snake who replaced him? Either, both. The young sultan's the one who's disappeared. She was careless, wasteful. He lived like tomorrow would never come and let us pay for it. But at least he was just foolish, not cruel. Rashid spat into the sawdust. This new one, though, the advisor who sits on the throne now, he's something worse. He's clever. Every decree he makes sounds reasonable, increasing efficiency, streamlining collection, maintaining order. But the result is always the same. We have less, and the palace has more. And anyone who questions it too loudly, well, they tend to disappear. Disappear? Arrested for sedition, or they simply vanish in the night, found floating in the river if they're found at all. Rashid lowered his voice. My neighbor's son spoke out at the market about the taxes. 3 days later, guards came and took him. The family hasn't seen him since. The prince felt cold despite the afternoon heat. This was what Samir had become, or perhaps what he'd always been, now that he had the power to show his true nature. Someone should stop him, the prince said quietly. Who? Rashid laughed bitterly. The rich? They're comfortable. The guards? They're being paid well to look the other way. Us? He gestured at the poor street around them. We can barely feed ourselves. We have no weapons, no training, no organization. We're not an army. We're just people trying to survive. The prince nodded slowly, but his mind was working. Just people trying to survive. But there were thousands of them, tens of thousands, and if they could be organized, if they could be given hope, if someone they trusted would lead them, an idea was forming, dangerous, possibly foolish, but the only idea he had. That night, the prince sought out a place he'd been avoiding, the tavern where day laborers gathered after work, where information flowed as freely as cheap wine. He slipped in quietly, taking a seat in a dark corner. No one paid him much attention. Another ragged figure was nothing unusual here. He listened to the conversations around him. Taxes again, raised again, 5th time. My sister's selling her wedding jewelry just to eat. Heard the new sultan's building himself a new palace wing while we starve. The young sultan, the one who left, at least he was one of us, born here, knew the city. One of us? He was worse. He's the one who spent all the money in the first place. The arguments went back and forth. Some defended the missing prince, saying at least he'd been born to rule. Others called him a wastrel who'd abandoned them. Most agreed that Samir was worse, but disagreed on what could be done about it. The prince sat in his corner, listening, learning. These were his people, and they were suffering because of his choices, both his wastefulness before and his absence now. He thought of Amina's words, "We are all beggars before God." And he thought of something his father had told him once, years ago, when he was too young and arrogant to listen. A sultan is not above his people. He is part of them, first among equals but still equal. Without them, he is nothing. Finally, when the crowd had grown large and the wine had flowed freely enough to loosen tongues, but not so freely as to make men senseless, the prince stood. He climbed onto a table, a dramatic gesture, but one that immediately drew attention. Conversation stopped. Faces turned toward him. "Brothers?" he said, and his voice, trained from childhood to command attention in throne rooms, carried across the tavern. "I've been listening to you talk about your suffering, about the taxes, about the injustice, about your hunger and your fear. Who are you?" someone called out. "No one important," the prince replied. "I'm a beggar, like many of you. I've slept in your streets. I've been beaten by the same thugs. I've felt the same hunger. But I've also learned something that you seem to have forgotten." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "You have power. More power than any sultan, any guard, any tax collector. Do you know why?" "We have no power," someone shouted. "We have nothing." "You have numbers," the prince replied. "There are thousands of you, tens of thousands, and there are only hundreds of guards. You build the buildings, you carry the water, you bake the bread, you make this city run. Without you, the palace is just empty stone." Murmurs ran through the crowd, some nodding, others skeptical. "What are you suggesting?" asked an older man, his voice cautious. "Rebellion? We'd be slaughtered." "No," the prince said, "not rebellion. Something smarter. Something the false sultan can't fight with swords." He had their full attention now. "What if you simply stopped? Stopped working yourself to death for taxes you can't pay. Stopped selling everything you own to feed a palace that doesn't care if you live or die. What if instead you helped each other? Shared what little you have, supported your neighbors, built a community so strong that you don't need the sultan's charity because you have each other." "That's crazy," someone said. But others were listening, thoughtful. "Is it?" The prince looked around at their faces. "The false sultan has power only because you give it to him. You work, you pay, you obey. But what if you didn't? What if you created your own system, your own justice, your own support? What if you showed the palace that you don't need them, that you're stronger together than any sultan could make you?" A woman near the front spoke up. "And when the guards come, when they drag us to prison for not paying taxes?" "Then we stand together," the prince said. "They can't arrest everyone. They can't imprison thousands. And if we're organized, if we're united, if we care for each other and protect each other, they can't break us." Rashid the carpenter stood from where he'd been sitting. "I know this man," he said, and heads turned toward him. "I've worked alongside him. He speaks truth. He's been helping people all over the poor quarters, asking nothing in return. And he's right about this. Alone, we're nothing. But together we could starve united instead of separately," someone called out, and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. But the prince could see the idea taking root, the possibility, the hope. "I'm not asking you to follow me," he said. "I'm asking you to follow each other, to remember that you're not alone, to build something that can't be broken because it's not built on one man's power, but on all of your strength combined." He climbed down from the table. "Think about it. Talk among yourselves. And if you decide you want to try chai, I'll be here, working alongside you, not above you, but with you." He walked toward the door, and as he did, he heard the conversations exploding behind him. Argument, debate, discussion. Some dismissed him as a madman, others called him dangerous, but some Chinachwere saying, "What if he's right?" It was a beginning. Chapter 12. A Plan Beneath the Moon. Over the next days, the prince's idea spread through the poor quarters like fire through dry grass. It started small. A few families agreed to pool their resources, to share food and help with work. When tax collectors came to one house, the neighbors would gather, not threatening, not violent, just present. witnessing, making it clear that these people were not alone. The collectors, used to dealing with isolated, frightened individuals, didn't know how to handle organized groups. Some backed down. Others reported to their superiors with confusion and concern. The prince worked tirelessly, moving from quarter to quarter, helping organize, encouraging, showing people how to support each other. He carried water for those too weak. He helped repair homes. He taught people what he'd learned about community from Amina. And slowly, word began to reach him from unexpected sources. A guard, one of the younger ones, approached him in a market. "I know who you are," the guard said quietly. "My father knew your father. You look like him. I can see it in your face, beneath the dirt and beard." The prince tensed, ready to run, but the guard raised his hands peacefully. "I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to tell you that not all guards support the false sultan. Some of us remember our oaths. We swore to protect the people, not oppress them. If you're truly the rightful sultan, some of us would stand with you." "How many?" the prince asked. "Not enough to take the palace by force, but enough to make a difference when the time comes." The prince nodded slowly. "Then wait. Watch. When I move, if I move, I'll need you." Other supporters appeared. Merchants who'd been squeezed by Samir's taxes. Minor nobles who'd been pushed aside when Samir consolidated power. Even some of the palace servants who slipped out to make contact, reporting what was happening inside the walls. "The false sultan grows paranoid," one told the prince. "He sees conspiracies everywhere. Half the court is under watch. He trusts no one." "Good," the prince said. "Fear makes men careless." But the most important meeting happened on the 25th night, 5 days before the wager's end. Amina found him. He was in a square that had become an informal gathering place for his growing network of supporters. Not an army. She was careful to avoid that appearance, just people who'd decided to help each other, to stand together. He saw her approaching through the crowd, and his heart lifted and sank simultaneously. Joy at seeing her safe, fear that her presence meant danger. "Amina," he said as she reached him, "you shouldn't be here. If Samir's men see you with Michi, let them see," she said firmly. Then, looking around at the gathered people, she raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy, Farid, or should I call you by another name?" So she knew, or had guessed. He led her aside, to a quieter corner. "How did you find out?" "I'm not blind," she said. "A man who speaks like nobility, who moves like royalty even in rags, who understands statecraft and politics. Chand, who apparently has the false sultan sending assassins after him. It wasn't difficult to deduce." She paused. "The real question is, what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know," he admitted. "The wager ends in 5 days. I could try to return to the palace, claim my throne. But Samir has been consolidating power for almost a month now. He might not let me in. Or worse, he might let me in and have me killed the moment I cross the threshold." "So you need leverage," Amina said. "Something that makes it impossible for him to refuse you or harm you." "Like what?" She gestured at the crowd around them. "Like them. Like the people. You've spent this month winning their trust, their loyalty. They know you now, not as a distant sultan in a palace, but as someone who's lived among them, suffered with them, helped them. That's worth more than any army." The prince shook his head. "I can't ask them to fight for me. They'd be slaughtered." "I'm not talking about fighting." Amina's eyes were bright with the idea forming in her mind. "I'm talking about witness, about truth. When you return to the palace, you don't go alone and you don't go in secret. You go with thousands of people behind you. You go in daylight where everyone can see. You go as their champion, not just as a prince reclaiming his throne. Samir could still refuse. Could he? Amina challenged. With thousands watching? With guards who might be sympathetic to you? With the whole city seeing that the people support you? He'd have to kill you publicly in front of everyone. And even if he's willing to do that, which would make him a usurper and a murderer in everyone's eyes, some of those guards might refuse the order. The prince thought about it. It was risky, terribly risky, but it was also the only plan that didn't require him to sneak, to hide, to approach as a supplicant begging for what was rightfully his. I'd need to convince them, he said. The people. I'd need them to believe not just that I'm the rightful sultan, but that I'd be a better one than I was before. Then show them, Amina said simply. You have 5 days. Use them. The next days were a blur of activity. The prince still dressed in rags, still living among the people, called meetings in squares, in taverns, in any place where people would gather and listen. He didn't proclaim himself sultan, not yet. He simply talked about what he'd learned. I lived in a palace, he told them, and I thought I knew what it meant to rule. I didn't. I knew nothing. I didn't know what it meant to carry water until your arms shake, to watch your children go hungry, to work until your hands bleed and still not have enough. People listened. They'd heard him before, but now his message was more focused. The false sultan who sits on the throne now, she sees you as resources to be extracted, like gold from a mine. I was no better. I saw you as subjects who existed to support my comfort, but I was wrong. A kingdom isn't the palace and the throne. A kingdom is the people. You are the kingdom, and any sultan who forgets that is no sultan at all. What are you saying? Someone called out. I'm saying that if I ever sit on that throne again, Chan, that's for you to decide, not me, Chi. I will never forget what I learned this month. I will remember that every coin spent in the palace is a coin taken from your table. I will remember that justice delayed is justice denied. I will remember that a sultan's first duty is not to his own glory, but to his people's welfare. Words are cheap, a woman shouted. The false sultan said fine words too at first. You're right, the prince acknowledged. Words are cheap, so I'll make you a promise here before all these witnesses. If you support me in reclaiming the throne, I will halve the taxes within the first month. I will open the palace granaries to feed the hungry. I will establish a council of common people merchants, farmers, laborers to advise me, so that I never again forget to listen. And if I break these promises, I will step down, voluntarily, because I'd rather be a beggar who keeps his word than a sultan who breaks it. Murmurs ran through the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, all thoughtful. Rashid the carpenter stood. I'll support you, he said. Not because I think you're perfect, but because I've seen you work, I've seen you help, and I believe you've learned what you needed to learn. I'll support you too, said the woman from the water well. You carried my burdens when no one else would. One by one, people began to stand. Not everyone, there were still skeptics, still those who'd been burned too many times to trust easily. But enough, more than enough. Then here's what I propose, the prince said. In 3 days, on the 30th day, I will walk to the palace. I'll walk openly in daylight and I'll claim my throne. I'm not asking you to fight. I'm asking you to witness, to come with me, to show the false sultan and his guards that I don't stand alone, that I stand with you, and you with me. And if he refuses? Someone asked. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I don't think he will. Because the one thing the false sultan fears more than anything is the people united. That's why he's worked so hard to keep you divided, isolated, afraid. The prince looked around at the sea of faces. In 3 days, we show him that we're not afraid anymore. Chapter 13. The Return to the Palace. The morning of the 30th day dawned clear and bright, the sun rising over the city like a golden coin. The prince woke in the square where he'd spent the night, surrounded by hundreds of others who'd gathered in preparation for the march. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities. What could go wrong? What could go right? What he'd say when he finally faced Samir. But now, in the morning light, there was no more time for planning. It was time to act. Amina found him as he was washing his face at a public fountain. She brought him something wrapped in clean cloth. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it." He unwrapped it to find a simple robe, not fine silk, but good clean cotton. White, the color of truth and new beginnings. It was clearly the best garment Amina owned, possibly her only good one. "I can't take this," he protested. "You can and you will," she said firmly. "You're going to face the false sultan. You're going to reclaim your throne. You can't do it in rags so torn they barely cover you. This isn't about vanity, it's about dignity, yours and ours." He understood. To go before the palace in complete rags would make them all look desperate, pathetic. But to go in simple, clean clothes that spoke of dignity, of people who had little but maintained their self-respect. He changed into the robe. It fit reasonably well, a bit short in the arms, but otherwise fine. Amina had also brought a simple turban, white like the robe. "There," she said, stepping back to look at him. "Now you look like what you are, man of the people who's ready to lead them." By mid-morning, thousands had gathered. The prince stood at the front of the crowd and marveled. Merchants in their working clothes, laborers with their tools still in their belts, mothers carrying children, old men leaning on staffs, young people with fire in their eyes. Not an army, a people. And scattered among them he spotted the guards who'd promised to support him, men in uniform, who'd positioned themselves strategically, ready to act if violence broke out. Rashid approached him. "We're ready," he said. "Just say the word." The prince climbed onto a cart so everyone could see him. "People of this city," he called out, and his voice carried across the crowd. "Today we walk to the palace, not to make war, but to demand justice, not to destroy, but to reclaim what was stolen. We walk together, peacefully, and we show the man who sits on my throne that his time is over." "Are you the prince?" someone shouted. "Are you really the Sultan's son?" It was time to stop hiding. "I am," the prince called back. "I am the son of the old Sultan, and I was a poor ruler. I wasted your money on my pleasures. I ignored your suffering. I was blind to what really mattered, and when I made a foolish wager, my supposed friend, took advantage of it to steal my throne." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I am not that man anymore. The month I've spent with you has changed me. I've learned what it means to be truly poor. I've learned that the measure of a man isn't his wealth, but his character. And I've learned that a sultan without his people is nothing." "How do we know you've really changed?" a woman called out. "How do we know you won't go back to your old ways once you're comfortable again?" "You don't," the prince said honestly. "I can only prove it through my actions, day after day, year after year. But I'm asking you to give me that chance. Walk with me today, help me reclaim the throne, and then hold me accountable. Every day, if I fail you, remove me. I would rather be removed for failing my promises than praised for keeping silent while you suffer." The crowd stirred. Conversations rippled through it. And then Amina stepped forward. "I'll walk with you," she called out loudly. "This man stayed in my home. He shared our food. He worked without complaint. He protected my children from an assassin when he could have run. I believe he's changed, and I believe he deserves a chance to prove it. I'll walk too, Rashid added. I've worked beside him. I've seen his blisters and his sweat. He's no stranger to labor now. One by one, others added their voices. The momentum built, swelling like a wave. Then let's walk, the prince said. Peacefully, proudly, together, and they began to move. The procession wound through the streets like a great river. Thousands strong, it flowed toward the palace. People came out of their houses to watch. Some joined the march. Others simply stared in amazement. Word spread ahead of them. The prince has returned. The prince is marching on the palace. The people are with him. Guards appeared at intersections, blocking the way. But when they saw the size of the crowd, Chan spotted their fellow guards marching with the people. They stepped aside. What else could they do? Attack thousands of unarmed civilians? Even those loyal to Samir balked at that. As they walked, the prince saw his city as he'd never seen it before. The streets he'd ridden through in carriages, never really noticing. The buildings he'd passed without thought. The people he'd ignored. Now he saw it all clearly. The beauty and the poverty, the strength and the suffering, the potential and the neglect. This is my city, he thought. These are my people, and I will not fail them again. They reached the palace square. The great gates stood before them, closed and barred. Guards lined the walls, arrows knocked, spears ready. The crowd came to a stop, filling the square completely. Thousands of eyes turned toward those gates. For a long moment, nothing happened. The tension stretched like a bowstring drawn to its limit. Then the gates opened, not fully, just enough for a single man to emerge. Samir. Chapter 14. The Judgment of the False Sultan. Samir walked out through the partially opened gates with careful, measured steps. He was dressed in the finest robes, the Sultan's robes, cloth of gold and silk, jeweled and magnificent. The crown sat on his head, slightly too large, catching the sunlight. Behind him, visible through the gap in the gates, stood a dozen guards with drawn swords. But Samir was smiling. That same clever smile the prince remembered from 1,000 nights of wine and laughter. The smile of a man who always had a plan, always saw the angles, always knew how to win. "Well, well," Samir called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Look who's returned, my dear friend, the prince. And you've brought quite a crowd." He walked closer, stopping about 20 paces from where the prince stood at the front of the mass of people. "I'm impressed," Samir continued. "When I sent that assassin Chies, let's not pretend, I sent him I thought you'd be dead by now, or at least broken, begging to come back. But here you are, looking almost dignified. How unexpected." "The gates, Samir," the prince said quietly. "Open them." "Why would I do that?" Samir's smile widened. "I've been sultan for 30 days now, very productive days, I might add. I've streamlined the government, increased revenues, established order. The kingdom runs more efficiently than it ever did under your wasteful rule." "You've starved the people to feed your own ambition," the prince replied. "You've turned guards into oppressors and tax collectors into thieves. You've betrayed every trust, broken every friendship, and stolen a throne that was never yours to take." "Stolen?" Samir laughed. "You gave it to me, remember? You walked away. You chose your foolish pride over your responsibility, and I simply remained. Someone had to sit on that throne. Someone had to make the hard decisions you were too weak to make." The prince felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce. But he controlled it. He'd learned control in his month on the streets, learned patience, learned to think before acting. "You're right," he said, and saw surprise flicker across Samir's face. I did walk away. I was foolish, arrogant, and irresponsible. I failed as a sultan. I failed my people." He gestured at the crowd behind him. "But I learned. I've spent this month living as they live, suffering as they suffer, working as they work. And I've learned what you never could. That power means nothing without the people's support. That a throne is just a chair if no one respects the man sitting in it." "Very touching," Samir said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Very noble. But here's the problem with your heartwarming tale of redemption. I have the palace. I have the guards. I have the power. And you have, what? A crowd of beggars and laborers? What exactly do you think they can do against trained soldiers?" "That's your mistake," the prince said. "You think this is about force, about who has more swords. But it's not. It's about legitimacy, about right, about the people's will." He raised his voice so the entire square could hear. "I am the son of the old sultan. I am the rightful heir to this throne. And more importantly, I am the choice of these people. They've seen me, they've known me, they've judged me and decided to give me another chance." He turned to Samir. "You've been judged too, by the hungry children you've ignored, by the families you've taxed into poverty, by the people you've oppressed, and they've found you wanting." "How poetic," Samir said. But the prince could hear a new note in his voice. Uncertainty, but still irrelevant. "Guards." He turned toward the gate, clearly intending to give an order, to have his men attack, to have the prince arrested. But before he could speak, something happened that neither of them expected. The guards on the walls lowered their weapons. One by one they set down their bows, their spears. Some remained at attention, unsure, but others, the ones the prince had cultivated, the ones who remembered their oaths, began to descend from the walls. And through the gates, pushing past Samir's personal guards, came a familiar figure. The old chamberlain, the one who'd served the old sultan faithfully. "Enough!" The chamberlain's voice rang out, sharp with authority despite his age. "This farce has gone on long enough." He walked past Samir Chwu, stood frozen, his smile finally cracking. Chand approached the prince. He bowed, deeply and formally. "My lord," the chamberlain said, "the palace awaits its rightful sultan." Samir spun around. "You dare? I am sultan. I gave you orders." "You were regent," the chamberlain interrupted coldly. "Temporarily, the prince made a wager and he's fulfilled it. 30 days as a beggar. The wager is complete. His throne is restored by right." "Right." Samir's composure was crumbling now, his voice rising. "I've been sultan for a month. I've made alliances, signed treaties, given orders. You can't just undo everything you've done," the prince said quietly, "can be undone, because it was built on theft and lies. But I'm not going to have you executed, Samir. I'm not going to throw you in a dungeon or exile you to die in the desert." He stepped closer, and now it was just the two of them, face to face, former friends meeting as enemies. "I'm going to do something worse," the prince continued. "I'm going to let you live. Let you see what a real sultan does. Let you watch as I undo all your cruelty, heal all your wounds, rebuild everything you've damaged. You're going to live a long life, Samir, knowing that you had power and used it to hurt people, and knowing that you lost it, not to a sword, but to truth." For a long moment, Samir just stared at him. Then something in his face changed. The clever mask fell away, and beneath it was something ugly, pure, bitter hatred. "You think you've won?" Samir hissed. "You think 1 month of playing beggar makes you worthy? You're still the same wasteful fool you always were. You'll fail, you'll fall, and when you do, I'll be there to watch." "Maybe," the prince agreed. Maybe I will fail, but at least I'll fail trying to do right. What will your legacy be, Samir? What will people say about you?" Samir had no answer. The prince nodded to the guards who'd descended from the walls. "Escort him to the gates," he ordered. "Give him a horse, food for a week, and a purse of gold. Then see him beyond the city limits." "My lord," one of the guards protested. "He tried to have you killed. He stole your throne. Surely he deserves mercy," the prince interrupted. "Because mercy is what separates a just ruler from a tyrant. Because I will not begin my second chance by acting like the man I used to be, and because somewhere inside him there might still be a chance for change, though I doubt he'll take it." He looked at Samir one last time. "Go, Samir. Leave this city and never return. If you do, the mercy I'm showing today will not be repeated." Samir opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. His clever tongue, which had never failed him, could find nothing to say. He turned and walked toward the gates, escorted by guards, his stolen crown left lying in the dust where it had fallen from his head. The crowd watched in silence as he disappeared through the gates. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they began to cheer. Chapter 15. The Just Sultan. The prince stood before the gates of his palace, and for the first time in 30 days felt no urge to enter. The crowd's cheers washed over him like waves, and he raised his hands for silence. Slowly the noise subsided. "People of this city," he said, and his voice was clear and strong. "I will not go into that palace and sit on that throne as if nothing has changed, because everything has changed. I have changed." He gestured back at the building behind him. "That palace was built by your ancestors. It's maintained by your labor. It exists because you allow it to exist. And for too long, the men who sat in it, myself included, forgot that. We thought we ruled you, but the truth is we serve you, or we should." He walked forward into the crowd, letting them surround him. "So before I enter those gates, I want to make something clear. I am not your master. I am your servant. My only job is to make your lives better, to protect you, to provide for you, to ensure justice, to maintain peace. And if I fail at that job, it's not just my failure, it's yours too, for allowing it." He looked around at the faces surrounding him: Chamina, Rashid, the water carrier, the old woman who'd shared her bread, all the people who'd helped him learn what it meant to be truly human. "I'm going to make mistakes," he continued. "I'm going to fail sometimes because I'm human. But I promise you this: I will never stop trying. I will never stop listening. And I will never forget what I learned in the month I spent with you." The old chamberlain approached him, carrying the crownschnot, the gaudy one Samir had worn, but the simple circlet his father had preferred, gold but unadorned. "My lord," the chamberlain said, "will you accept your crown?" The prince looked at it for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Not yet. Not until I've earned it again. For now, I'm just a man who's been given a second chance. Let me prove I deserve it before I wear the symbol of it." The chamberlain smiled, the first genuine smile the prince had seen on his weathered face in years. Chan bowed. "As you wish, my lord, but the throne still awaits." The prince entered the palace, and this time he didn't enter alone. He brought 100 people with him, representatives from every quarter, every trade, every class. They walked through halls that had been closed to common people for generations, and they marveled at the beauty and the waste. "All of this," the prince said, gesturing at the silk hangings, the jeweled decorations, the golden fixtures, "belongs to you. It was bought with your money. And I'm going to sell most of it." Gasps echoed through the halls. "Not all," he clarified. "Some must be maintained, the throne itself, certain ceremonial objects, things that represent the kingdom's heritage, but the excess, the unnecessary luxury, we're selling it, and the money will go to the treasury key, not to be hoarded, but to be used for food relief, for public works, for schools, for medicine. He led them to the throne room. The great chair sat empty, dust motes dancing in the light that streamed through high windows. This throne, he said, has held tyrants and saints, fools and wise men. My father sat here with humility. I sat here with arrogance. Samir sat here with ambition. But from today forward, whoever sits here will sit with one thing above all else: responsibility. He turned to face the people he'd brought with him. I'm going to establish a council, he announced. Representatives from the people's merchants, farmers, laborers, craftspeople, even beggars. They'll meet with me regularly. They'll advise me. They'll tell me when I'm wrong, and their voice will have weight because they represent you. Rashid stepped forward. How do we know this isn't just more empty promises? How do we know you won't change your mind once you're comfortable again? You don't, the prince said honestly. But here's what I'm going to do. Every month, I will walk through the city. Not in a carriage, not with guards clearing the way, just walking like I did this past month. I will hear complaints directly. And if anyone feels I've broken my promises, they can challenge me publicly, and I will answer. He paused, then added, and one more thing. Amina? Amina stepped forward from the crowd, looking nervous but determined. You taught me more in a few days than I learned in 25 years of palace life, the prince said. You showed me what true generosity means, what real nobility is, and I want you to serve on this council, to help me remember where I came from. Or rather, where I learned to actually be human. I'm just a widow, Amina protested. I have no education, no chi. You have wisdom, the prince interrupted. You have compassion. You have experience that no book could teach me. Will you help me? Amina looked at her children, who nodded eagerly. Then she looked back at the prince and smiled. I will, on one condition. Name it. That you never forget that white robe I gave you. Keep it. Wear it sometimes instead of silk, to remember. I will, the prince promised. I'll wear it every month when I walk the streets, so I never forget. The next days were a whirlwind of activity. The prince's first official act was to reduce taxes by half exactly as he'd promised. The treasury could barely afford it, but he made up the difference by selling the palace's excesses. Golden platters were melted down, jeweled decorations were auctioned, expensive carpets were sold to wealthy foreign merchants. His second act was to open the palace granaries. For weeks, anyone who was hungry could come and receive grain, no questions asked. The stores diminished rapidly, but the prince didn't care. We can rebuild our supplies, he said. We can't rebuild lives lost to starvation. His third act was to reform the guard. He dismissed those who'd been loyal to Samir's cruelty and promoted those who'd shown honor. The new captain of the guard was one of the men who'd marched with the people, a young soldier who'd risked his position to support the prince's return. Your job, the prince told him, is not to protect me from the people. It's to protect the people from anyone who would harm them, including me, if I become what I once was. The captain bowed. I understand, my lord. Word of what was happening in the city spread throughout the kingdom and beyond. Some neighboring rulers were scandalized. Sultan, who walked among commoners, who sold his palace treasures, who established a council of peasants. It was unheard of, but others were intrigued, and within the city itself, life began to change. The markets, which had been sullen and desperate, began to bustle with renewed energy. People had money to spend, not much, but more than before. They could afford bread that wasn't mostly air. They could buy extra food, save a bit, even splurge occasionally on something nice. The streets became safer. The thugs who'd preyed on beggars found themselves facing organized community watches. Crime didn't disappear, it never does, but it diminished. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. People began to hope. Hope that tomorrow might be better than today. Hope that their children might have opportunities they'd never had. Hope that their sultan actually cared whether they lived or died. 1 month after reclaiming his throne, the prince kept his promise. He dressed in the white robe Amina had given him, put on simple sandals, and walked out of the palace gates alone. His advisors protested, his guards worried, but he insisted. "If I'm to rule these people," he said, "I must walk among them, not occasionally as a condescending gesture, regularly, as a practice, as a reminder." He walked through the city he'd come to know so well. He stopped at the fountain where he'd first been beaten and washed his bloodied face. He visited the corner where the old woman had shared her bread cheese. She was still there, and she laughed with delight when she recognized him. "You did well, grandson," she said, using the same affectionate term she'd used when he was just another beggar. "Your father would be proud." He visited Rashid's carpentry shop and spent an hour helping cut lumber, his hands finding the rhythm of work they'd learned. He walked through the poorest quarters, where children who'd been hollow-eyed with hunger now played with slightly more energy, slightly more joy. And everywhere he went, people approached him, some with complaints, which he listened to and noted, some with thanks, which he accepted with humility, some just to touch his robe, as if to confirm he was real. At the end of the day, as the sun was setting, he found himself back in the square where he'd made his speech, where he'd led the march to the palace. Amina was there, as if she'd known he'd come. "How was your walk?" she asked. "Humbling," he said. "Every month I do this, I remember how far I have to go, how much I still don't understand." "Good," Amina said. "The day you think you understand everything is the day you become the man you used to be." They stood together in silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Do you think," the prince asked quietly, "that I'll be able to keep this up? This balance between being sultan and staying connected to the people? Or will I slowly drift back, become isolated again, surrounded by luxury until I forget?" Amina considered the question seriously. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think the fact that you're asking means you have a chance, and I'll be there with the council to remind you when you start to drift. Promise?" "I promise." Oh. Epilogue. Years later. Years passed, and the tale of the beggar prince became legend. Children in the streets played games where one would pretend to be the proud prince, and another would be the wise beggar who taught him humility. Poets composed verses about the month of transformation. Scholars debated the lessons it taught about power and responsibility. But in the palace, now much simpler than it had been, now open to visitors from all walks of life, the sultan who'd once been a beggar continued his work. He married Amina, and together they raised her children, and eventually their own, in a palace that was more home than monument. His council of common people met monthly, and their advice shaped every major decision he made. The taxes stayed low. The granaries were kept full for emergencies. Schools were built in every quarter. Public wells were maintained and cleaned. Guards served and protected rather than intimidated. It wasn't perfect. There were still problems, still injustices, still suffering. But there was also hope and justice, and a sense that the man on the throne actually cared. And every month, without fail, the sultan put on his white robe and walked through his city, listening to his people, remembering his lesson, keeping his promise. Sometimes, when he was alone in the throne room late at night, he would think about Samir, wondering where he'd gone, what he'd become, whether he'd ever learned anything from his fall. But mostly the Sultan thought about his father, about the wisdom the old man had tried to impart, which had fallen on deaf ears for so long. "I understand now, Father," he would whisper to the empty room. "I understand what you tried to teach me, that without the people, I am nothing, that a throne is just furniture unless it's used in service, that the true measure of a ruler is not how much power he holds, but how much good he does with it." And in those quiet moments, he could almost feel his father's presence, proud and approving. The tale ends here, dear listener, as all tales must end. But remember this: the story of the Beggar Prince is not just about one man's transformation. It's about all of us, about how we use whatever power we have, whether it's the power of a sultan or simply the power to help our neighbor. It's about remembering that we are all beggars before God, all dependent on mercy, all in need of compassion. And it's about the choice we make every day, to be like the first prince, blind and arrogant, or like the second, humbled and wise. So when you wake tomorrow, think on this tale and ask yourself, what kind of person will you be? Will you walk past suffering, or will you stop to help? Will you hoard your blessings, or will you share them? For in the end, we are all both beggars and sultans, all in need, and all with something to give. May your sleep be peaceful, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle, and may you wake with a heart ready to see others, to help others, to be better than you were yesterday. In the tradition of Scheherazade and the 1001 Nights, this tale is told. The End.